Avis, cette capsule a été produite simultanément en français et en anglais. Notice, this episode was produced simultaneously in English and French. Vous écoutez présentement la version anglaise. You are currently watching the English version.
Hello and welcome to STereotypic STeist. I'm your host, Guy from the other day. I've been looking forward to talking about this game for a long time. One of the best released for the Atari ST, one of the most spectacular at the time, and an example of programming efficiency pushed to the extreme. This car racing game is Vroom from the French company Lankhor, published in 1991. If you watched my episodes on Maupiti Island and Le Manoir de Mortevielle, you already know the main players who contributed to the company's notoriety. But to the number we must add one, Daniel Macré, with an acute accent on top of the letter E.
Before joining the Lankhor team, Daniel Macré had a serious career in IT for the manufacturer Digital Equipment Corporation. Among his hobbies, he also had the project of designing and programming a racing game akin to pole position on a Sinclair QL computer.
Without going into details, I'd like to explain just a little about how car racing games worked in the late 1970s and early 1980s.
One of the oldest examples is Night Driver, first released in 1976 for arcade cabinets, then adapted in 1978 for the Atari 2600. Quite simplistic and monochrome, with no other goal than reaching the best score. Then, in 1981, we got Sega's full-color game Turbo, in which an analog scaler was used to change the proportions of scenery elements, causing some distortions. I think the other elements shown were simply sprites that were scaled in advance, so that we just had to show the right one of the right size at the right position. For a very long time, scaling was used to modify the size of scenery elements as well as that of sprites. To speed up the process, several sizes and orientations could have been established in advance, but this would require a lot of memory. For Pole Position, released in 1982, video chips were designed for both scrolling and scaling.
This game was the starting point for Daniel Macré, reproducing pole position on a Sinclair QL, a major challenge.
First, to achieve the maximum possible frame rate, one should not code using an interpreter. Although it can be done, the execution of the code remains slow, and even when compiled, it's still far from reaching the maximum performance of any given computer. Additionally, the car we're driving, when depicted, almost always appears in the bottom center of the screen. It's the setting or scenery and its elements that move or change, ideally every vertical blank at the very least once everything has been drawn in the background before swapping with the physical screen. In some other games, however, we are in the car, but the fact remains that it's once again outside elements that move or change. It's a lot to consider and to keep in mind, constantly.
And that's partly why car driving or racing games on consoles or computers have long been ordinary, let's say.
Until the development of raycasting and PPUs or GPUs capable of handling and rendering polygonal 3D with textures, the naturalistic aspect of racing games left something to be desired. However, what contributed to immersion always resided more in the frame rate, the number of images displayed every second. The more the better. Even during the PS1 era, we achieved this by making compromises starting with the display distance, the rule being, if it's too far, we don't display or we refrain from details.
Daniel Macré therefore designed and programmed Vroom for the Sinclair QL.
Given that the original version of Vroom had been coded in assembly language for Daniel Macré, the transition from the Sinclair QL to the Atari ST was almost self-evident, the two computers having two very similar Motorola processors.
But why call on Lankhor? I'll briefly explain what happened.
Béatrice and Jean-Luc were published by the Pyramid Company for the game Wanderer. Then, one day, phone call. It was an English programmer calling Jean-Luc for details regarding the code for Wanderer. The adaptation rights had been sold to a British company without informing the B&JL team or paying them royalties. It was from this moment that Béatrice, Jean-Luc, and Bruno Gourrier, who initially met at Pyramid, decided to merge their companies to found a new one, Lankhor. It was also at Pyramid that they met Daniel Macré, and it was Pyramid who was to edit the ST version of Vroom, which was already well developed or advanced, but no contract having been signed, yet the members of Lankhor made Daniel an offer.
Then Bruno came up with the idea of a multiplayer mode, but the game code wasn't suited for that, and that's when Lankhor's team started to interfere with the code.
The road has been redesigned with its uneven terrain, more variations in terms of turns, as well as a greater flexibility of the car you're driving in relation to the road and its central axis, which I'll talk about later. Also, it was then necessary to rethink the sprites and to populate the universe, so to speak, with objects, the latter being pseudo-vector images combined with polygons. However, when the project of editing the ST version of Vroom was proposed, the Lankhor team was busy making the game Maupiti Island, and that's a bit why Vroom, the first ST version of Vroom more precisely, was only released the following year.
Finally, Daniel Macré joined the Lankhor team, in which he became an executive from 1996 to 2001. He is currently retired.
Vroom consists of a car racing game. That is to say, you have to overtake a certain number of opponents or competitors to arrive first ideally, whereas a car driving game consists rather of not hitting any obstacles. The initial ST version offers 6 circuits whose layouts correspond to real circuits: Sweden, France, Austria, Great Britain, United States, and Japan, with certain freedoms such as uneven terrains, tunnels, and promotional panels or boards. In this sense, World Circuit for PCs running DOS but also for Amiga and ST, published the following year, is closer to reality, but the gameplay for the ST and Amiga versions is imputed by this yearning for realism. The frame rate suffers.
These are two different schools of thought, and for me at the time what mattered was speed of execution.
In its initial ST version, Vroom offers 2 game modes, the first being Arcade, the second being Career. The Arcade mode is fitting when you want to get started with the game already, and you do get the choice of driving your car using either the joystick or the mouse, although the latter is more convenient in my opinion regarding the precision of your turns in Arcade mode, that is, as well as the speed of your car. Also, in Arcade mode, the circuits are presented to us in order, and the objective for each is to overtake a certain amount of competing cars within 5 laps, without damaging our own car too much, or I should say, crashing too often.
It's not that crashes cause the game to end, but they may cause a considerable waste of time.
In Career mode, you can choose to compete on a specific circuit or on all circuits in order. In this case, each driver is assigned a certain score depending on the position occupied at the end of the race. There is a certain humor regarding the names of competing racing drivers, which consist of distortions of the names of real drivers, at least at the time of Vroom's original release, which is the early 1990s. For the initial ST version, finally, in Career mode, our car must be controlled using the mouse, and it's not as simple as in Arcade mode, considering that the straightening of our car on the road doesn't happen automatically. I'll explain later.
Also, in career mode, your position at the start of the race depends on the qualifying lap, while in arcade mode, you always start last.
The screen is roughly divided into 3 segments. At the top, on the left, we have a bird's eye view of the circuit, with our location indicated by a black or white pixel depending on which version of Vroom you're playing. At the top right is the information panel displaying the name of the circuit and its geographical location, the stage at which we're competing, our current lap, the number of cars overtaken, those colored red corresponding to the minimum required in arcade mode, our fuel gauge, as well as the score. In the lower 2/3 finally are the visuals of the game, mainly the sky, the road and the grass, the image on the horizon, the elements of the setting or circuit, the competing cars, not to mention the car we're driving shown at the bottom.
It's a combination of images involving sprites, polygons, and pseudo-vectors.
We certainly could have illustrated everything using polygons like in Stunt Car Racer, but once again it's faster to use sprites and to position them on the screen, because this only requires copying and pasting, while drawing polygons requires trigonometric calculations, even with a referential matrix. In fact, for the basic visuals of Vroom, the sky, the grass, and the road, we use simple geometric figures. The sky and grass are mainly made up of blue or green colored rectangles accordingly, nothing extraordinary.
It's the on-screen tracing of the road that's more complicated, and I'll try to explain it to you as best as I can.
This portrayal depends on a central line or axis, which includes, for instance, objects, curvatures, and width. In arcade mode, the player is parallel to it. That is to say that he always follows a line adjacent to the central line, which explains the straightenings that I spoke of earlier in arcade mode.
In career mode, it's up to the player to remain parallel to the central line.
The road is drawn in the background, one horizontal line at a time, from bottom to top, that is, from the nearest point to the farthest point, unlike objects which are displayed from the farthest point toward the player's POV. The road I mean, is managed by its center like in 3D. The center is projected in 2 dimensions and the illustrated width of the road is assigned or affected on either side of this middle point based on the distance from the POV.
In other words, if we didn't draw the road but only its center, we'd see a line on the screen.
Also, one of the challenges of programming any car racing or driving game of the time or era lies in managing the curves. Traditionally, the road's visual was made up of a succession of predefined segments that were positioned gradually to the left or to the right, depending on the curvature and the position of our car. This is why sometimes the road seems to break at its edges. In Vroom, the shape or curvature, if applicable, also depends on one hand on the positioning of our car on the road in relation to the central line or axis, on the other hand on the curvature of the road when a bend presents itself, whether it's visible from a distance or when we engage in it to negotiate a turn.
This is a slightly more complex part of the program's code that involves calculations related to the speed and the centripetal force, in which the mass is constant.
Along with the center line or axis, curves are also numerical data. These are circular arcs whose radii have values corresponding to multiples of 2, 512, 256, 128, and so on, so as not to have to perform multiplications or divisions during gameplay, the latter requiring a huge amount of CPU cycles. Everything is projected in 2D following a reference table to limit trigonometric calculations during gameplay, a bit like we did for Stunt Car Racer.
Also, what speeds up the execution process is that our car always moves forward.
You cannot drive in a circuit in reverse, for example, which means that what you see, what is illustrated, is only made up of facades of polygonal objects or flat sprites like in Wolfenstein 3D. For the curvatures of the road, they can only be presented in certain ways following the central line, so that we don't let ourselves slip into the scenery, well, not too much, especially in arcade mode. At the very least, one cannot escape the play area. The rest consists mainly of a series of images. The one in the background is a static image whose width exceeds the screen's size, an image that loops and scrolls fluidly when necessary, and for which the offsets were defined beforehand, so as not to have to do it during the game. Then, over the grass and the road, we superimpose some elements, the most distant first, then the closest, the advertising panels, the lamppost, the white lines on the road, the white and red markings along the edges of the circuit, the competing cars, as well as our own car.
It's always the same principle. What is distant first, then gradually towards the observer's point of view.
For some elements, like lampposts, metal beams, panel legs, we don't fill the shape with a color but instead assign pre-calculated pixel lines for the edges and corners of the lamppost, for instance. It's its top or head that is a sprite. As for polygons representing large objects with a certain depth, these are polygons in the foreground, always perpendicular to the road, with other polygons connecting certain vertices to a second, more distant plane. This is, for example, what makes it possible to create platforms or stands.
So we display the basic colors, we trace the road from the observation points towards the horizon, we come back to the POV with the elements of the setting, and we draw the competing cars.
These competing cars are made up of a superposition of two distinct sprites, with a few visuals already scaled along with predefined angles, so as not to have to do it on the fly. For intermediate distances and intermediate visuals, we duplicate some of the sprite's horizontal lines. There are generally 3 colors for these cars, with 2 distinct tones for those in red and green, plus 3 variations of purple, for a total of 7 of the 16 available colors for the play area. Add to that the sky, the road, and the lines on the road, we are at 10 of the 16 available colors.
Because the cars in green borrow for one of the 2 tones the same color as the grass.
That's enough. In fact, including the background image and setting elements, we use all 16 available colors. We certainly could have had yellow competing cars, but we refrained from that because of memory constraints. Vroom was designed to run on a 520 ST.
Regarding colors, we actually exceed the 16 color limit, which is neat.
As with many games of the time, the palette is redefined during vertical blank. There is the one for the top of the screen with the circuit and other infos, then the one for the playing area at the bottom. The palette is redefined at a specific scanline showing black, which helps prevent flickering.
Sound-wise, we use the 3 tone channels. Yes, tone channels, not the aperiodic noise channel, at least not for the engine noise.
The main audible sounds consist of the roar of your car's engine as well as those of opposing cars. The noise essentially consists of an 8-bit sample modulated in power, so to speak, and frequency depending on the engine's RPM. For the output, the 3 channels are used simultaneously by modulating their volume to try to form a linear array. To accumulate sounds such as other cars or braking noises, we simply add samples.
We do use the noise channel, but only for certain events, like accidents.
Back to the visuals, we paid a lot of attention to detail. Your car, to begin with, is roughly made of 3 separate images. The front wheels, whose visual changes depending on the turns, the stresses endured by the suspension, as well as when you have an accident. The cockpit, notably involving 2 mirrors, the speedometer, the state of health of our car, particularly useful in career mode, as well as the rev counter, useful when driving in manual mode. The steering wheel, finally, with 2 gloved hands, which is reminiscent of the game Lombard Rally, with the major difference that in the latter, the cockpit represents approximately 3/5 of the screen.
Attention to detail extends beyond your car, of course.
If you deviate from the road, things get bumpy, and we simulate this by changing the position of what's shown on the y-axis by copying and pasting part of the background to an earlier or later memory address. In addition, there's occasionally an airship or plane in the sky, which consists of a sprite that moves and which must be taken into account when entering a curve and/or in the event of a difference in height of the ground. Finally, when, for instance, your car drives under an overpass or through a tunnel, we change some color tones of the palette so that they appear darker, even if only for a fraction of a second.
That said, the game in its original ST version is not devoid of curiosities.
The background image, which appears in a loop, does not cover all 360 degrees, so not only can one see the same visuals almost anywhere while driving in the circuit, but also different visuals in the same places.
This is a minor detail because during the game our attention is focused on the road.
Furthermore, competing cars, which are sprites, can disappear entirely in one go when you overtake them, but this is convenient precisely for overtaking. For example, in this case, the competing car ought to be immediately on the left, thus I shouldn't be able to change lanes without causing an accident. Moreover, accidents usually boil down to losing one of your front tires, or both tires blowing out, or slouching, so to speak. It's more realistic than, say, pole position, in which your car explodes when it hits another car or a billboard. In Vroom, an accident mainly wastes your time and damages your vehicle, except in arcade mode, which will force you to stop at or in a pit in order to change your tires by pressing the T key.
You can also refuel by pressing G. This is why reading the instruction manual is practical and even essential.
The game was a great success and was highly rated in magazines of the time. We had to make a sequel, or rather sequels. What was offered is the addition of circuits, but also a multiplayer mode in split screen, as well as the possibility of playing with the joystick in career mode, rather than being forced to use the mouse. Additionally, despite the details, the fluidity of the animation, or the number of frames per second, is maintained somewhat. It's not constant, especially when there are both polygons and sprites on the screen, and the latter in large numbers, but one can generally expect a solid 15 frames per second.
It's also one of the few racing games on the ST that can achieve this frame rate.
Finally, what contributes to the immersion is notably the player's point of view, and for me, it depends on the extent to which I'm able to forget that I'm playing a game, or that I'm invested in the story, the script, the protagonist's endeavor. I'm not going to make an anthology of all the car racing games that exist for the Atari ST, nor those that I personally own. However, I will say this, a majority does not hold up. The Atari ST was not designed for this specific purpose, thus I'm surprised to see what certain designers or programmers have managed to accomplish with this machine. In this sense, Vroom is an example of effective programming aimed at pushing the computer to its limits by eliminating from the code as many of what I call cycle wasters as possible.
This was today's episode. Thanks to Jean-Luc and Daniel Macré from Lankhor for their contribution to this episode. Thanks also to my patrons. If you'd like to support me, the link is in the description. Otherwise, like, subscribe, share, and don't hesitate to tell me in the comments your impressions regarding Vroom. Also, I've been asking myself this question: do the games that I've been showing you on this channel for some years make you want to play them? Also, if there are any games you'd like me to talk about, please let me know. I'm Guy from the other day. See you soon.